Future trends, future development is quite unclear. But now I would like to give the floor to our first speaker, as historian Ivita Ose, who will tell us about various crises that struck the housing market at the beginning of the 20th century. And she will also tell us how the city, how the official bodies tried to solve this crisis. Good afternoon. I'm Ivita Ose. I have a master's degree in history, but the topic of my research is the history of architecture in the interwar period, the functional architecture and its relation to the social and economic processes in Latvia and in the world, and the so-called actual real housing. Today I will tell about the search for housing or the type of housing for the middle classes. The First World War radically changed the political and economic situation in our region, but the topic of affordable and comfortable housing was still topical, both in Riga as the former province of the Russian Empire, as well as the capital of our nation. This was marked by two serious events, an exhibition organized in 1908, as well as a so-called housing crisis that struck Riga in the 20s of the previous century. At the beginning of the 20th century, Riga was dominated by wooden housing, small-scale wooden housing, mostly two-story housing that had wooden ovens. Very often there was no running water in this housing, but at the beginning of the 20th century, the brick housing was on the increase, and due to industrialization, the number of population increased, and the so-called rental buildings were constructed that had more than 20 flats and several rooms where at least 100 people resided. And almost a third of the citizens or the inhabitants of Riga lived in this type of housing at that time. So it was considered a degrading experience. Though this kind of housing is still a better solution where several families shared one apartment or one flat. This is a good example of the so-called lease housing, built according to the design of architect Vanags. So here there is a three-story building that faces the street and has an elaborate facade that you cannot see here, but the yard buildings do not have this kind of elaborate decoration. The planning differs. In these parallel five-story buildings, the street-facing building had larger apartments with several rooms, including rooms for the servants. But in the yard buildings, there were very small flats, and the smallest of them just had only one window, and they had to share the conveniences with two other families. And this is how our working classes lived 100 years ago. But this situation had to be changed, and then there was an unfortunate event. A priest, Schubert, was invited to a newlywed family, and the housewife showed their apartment, and though the priest found the apartment nice, he saw that all these things are of very low quality, though they looked nice. And when the priest was invited to sit down, the chair actually broke. And when he had fallen down, and when he found out that they had to pay 150 rubles for this kind of furniture, the priest thought that furniture that is not so decorated, not so ornamental, and that is quite simple but stable and reliable should be created. And this idea developed into one of the most progressive events of that age. And this idea was supported by many people, doctors, professors, and the craft chambers of Latvia. And in the summer of that year, an exhibition devoted to the working classes and their needs and the improvement of their lives was at the center of this exhibition, because the working classes faced many problems, for example, child mortality, alcohol abuse, and many others. These were the problems that the organizers of this exhibition tried to solve. In the exhibition areas, there were several pavilions, several departments, including one that was devoted to the TBC problem, namely how to combat this disease, how to combat the spread of this disease. And it was the spread of this disease was directly related to the bad hygienic situation in these working classes. The people were taught how to reduce the child mortality, the infant mortality, because approximately half of all the newborns were died before their first year of age. And then certain example gardens or sapun gardens were demonstrated, and the idea of garden colonies was promoted, where workers could spend time after their work and probably grow something useful. And this also had to be viewed in the context of social pedagogics, because the higher classes tried to show the lower classes how to live properly, because they did not know how to. They called themselves the friends of workers and tried to show that their conditions could be humane, not changing the existing system. The central event was to view a two-family house where two families of workers could live together with sample interiors, 12 types of sample interiors. Designs were created for the furniture. The furniture had to be quite simple, but of pleasant form and structure. Too complicated or too simplified offers were eliminated or were not accepted as non-compliant. The competition statutes required that the family house has to be built of wood and has to be intended for two families and had to have several rooms and a kitchen. Two designs were adopted and both received prizes. One was by Perkshans and Laube, which received the first prize. This is you can see one of the samples here. And both of these projects were built, and all the visitors could view the interior and exterior of the house. And the construction costs were estimated to be approximately 3,000 rubles. The architect has had an idea that the working families would have approximately 500 rubles in savings, and then they could also maybe obtain some mortgages from the bank, and compared also the monthly payment for a rented flat, and came to a conclusion that if this house is built, that it would ensure sufficient return to be paid back within 10 years. So, according to the design, a family with several children would have to live in 32 square meters of living space. And since this idea was very popular, they thought that there will be building societies that would be ready to build these houses. And the architect, Perkshans, was very fond of the idea that these societies could help the working classes to ensure sufficient housing. This idea was also very popular in many corporations, associations, and unions, and so on. But at that time, there was only one construction society of Riga at that time existing, And the members of this construction society was from the wealthy classes that actually built the so-called Mežaparks region of Latvia, of Riga. And 2 decades had to pass until the idea of smaller buildings for working families actually took shape. And now about the time after the First World War. Many changes in the society stimulated a demand for comfortable, hygienic, and quite inexpensive housing suitable for the middle classes. But the housing stock of Riga could not satisfy this demand. Thus, there was a housing crisis because the existing housing has become obsolete, and it was clear that a modern housing needed all the modern conveniences. There was insufficient housing in Riga as such, not to speak about modern housing, and it became especially acute when the war refugees returned to Latvia, to Riga. And in comparison to the pre-war period, the housing stock has decreased by 25%, and the flats were overcrowded, and there was a real housing crisis that needed solving. Municipality created a special commission, here you can see it, that relied on the need, or that based their work on the need for the maintenance of the existing housing and the construction of new housing to ensure the dynamic development of the city, and a preparation of various construction rules and regulations for private or privately sponsored, privately financed building. They also worked on mortgage requirements, various other needs and requirements, because then this issue was viewed as a public health issue. The rental law adopted at the beginning of the 20s, and the existing rental system did not stimulate the use or the investment of private capital in the construction of private housing, and thus the so-called communal or municipal building started in Riga. There were also some political factors in place. Examples from other Western cities were adopted, especially from the city of Vienna, where the communal housing, communal construction was quite widespread. And at that time, approximately 250,000 people lived in such housing. And in a special week devoted to this issue in 1927, during the holidays, there were several lectures delivered by then the head of the department responsible for the housing in Vienna, told about their experiences, showed examples from other cities in the Western countries, and he was also very active in the so-called Frankfurt social housing construction process later. A question of the typology of the new housing was very important, namely how large, what size, the apartments, the housing. And it was admitted that the family houses are better, the life is healthier because there is a garden. But this required more investment and additional infrastructure, as well as transportation network. Thus, from the economic point of view, multi-story buildings were found to be better. This was not an ideal, but it was still a compromise solution, as the ideal solution would be living like in his or her father's house, namely one family small house with a small garden. The size of the apartments in these compromise buildings were also a compromise, because a 3-room apartment, a separate bedroom for the family, for the parents and the children, was considered ideal. These small modern flats met the requirements of new families with regards to the hygiene and comfort, Almost all of them had separate bathrooms, and only in the apartment blocks in Ropažu Street, for example, the bath was placed in the kitchen. Also, for example, the so-called gas ovens were installed in these apartments. Special attention was paid to the ventilation that required some construction changes. There was also furniture installed in the kitchen, for example, and make this kitchen furniture ergonomic so that it's convenient to work there. Also, there was space allocated for the playgrounds, and they foresaw to construct, for example, libraries, kindergartens in the nearby area to improve the so-called social climate. When they decided where these buildings had to be constructed, several aspects were taken into account. For example, the lack of housing in the respective area and many others. But this was only a part of the solution to the housing crisis, because most contribution was given by the private construction. At that time, this kind of construction was stimulated by special crediting facilities and by offering sample designs. At the end of the 20s, a special housing fund was created. A decision about this housing fund was made, and the next year regulations were prepared on how finances would be granted from this fund, and the requirements were based on rational considerations. Cooperatives could receive approximately 25 to 30% co-financing for the construction cost, and private builders would receive 15%, but others would receive only 10% co-financing. So we see that the preference was given to cooperatives. I have to say that at that time, cooperatives were quite common in many other countries, especially after the First World War, as well as in Latvia, because at the beginning of the 20s, there were opinions in the mass media inviting the people to create these kind of cooperatives. And the result, several construction societies were established in Riga at that time. The members of these societies were quite active in the meetings of the Housing Crisis Commission, so there was a public participation in the municipal activities. There were also various surveys carried out to solve this crisis, asking questions to engineers, doctors, the academic world, and so on. The inhabitants of Riga could also write letters to the municipality indicating where they would like to obtain land for the construction of their houses. So they were mostly interested in the Torņkalns vicinity and in the so-called Vidzeme highway vicinity. And a general plan of Riga was prepared. According to this plan, such regions like Teika, Bieriņa, and many others, those willing to construct could obtain a land plot for very profitable requirements. And to ensure that this process is more homogeneous, standardized or sample designs were offered. In 1929, in 1930, beginning of 30s, these designs were prepared at the guidance of a person called Bērskāns. In total, there were 190. And a special brochure was published, and each and every person who was willing could pay a small fee and purchase these plans, these designs. And if these designs were used, the construction procedure or the formalities were much simpler. So, and then we can say that the standardized construction had its roots at the beginning of the 30s. There were also new construction materials used. Also, mortgages were obtainable. Typical designs were used that actually allowed to solve this housing crisis. But then the economic crisis struck, and the demand for housing became smaller, though the problem of overcrowding was not solved. But the crisis of the 20s showed that the society has become more modern, and the requirements for modern housing has become more stricter. But it was very difficult to meet the ever increasing demand for housing. The construction quality was not so good, and there were also problems with the construction in the suburban areas of Riga because of the lack of infrastructure. Thank you.